It was a quiet morning in court. Judge Elliot Thorne walked into the room wearing his black robe, holding a cup of coffee in one hand. The courtroom smelled of wood and paper, and the sound of footsteps echoed off the walls. He nodded to the bailiff, sat down his bench, and looked over the file for the day's trial. Everything seemed normal. The case was about money stolen from a local charity. It wasn't a small case, but it wasn't the biggest either. Still, Elliot was ready to listen and be fair, like always. He had done this for years. He was known for being calm and careful. Nothing surprised him anymore. Until now, the door opened, and the guard led the defendant into the courtroom. Elliot didn't look up at first. He was still reading the file. But when the man stood in front of the court, Elliot finally raised his eyes. And then he froze. His heart beat faster. He blinked, thinking he had seen wrong. But no, standing there in a simple gray suit, looking tired and older, was Sammy Harper. Sammy Harper, the same boy he had grown up with in the small town of Marlow Creek. The boy who used to race him on bikes through dusty back roads. The one who shared snacks with him at school and helped him build a treehouse behind Elliot's grandma's house. They had been best friends once, like brothers, always together. But something happened when they were 16. A fight, a bad one. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. Elliot had left for college, and Sammy had stayed behind. They never spoke again. Now, after all these years, Sammy was back, in front of him, not as a friend, not even as someone passing by, but as a man on trial. Elliot sat back in his chair. He tried to stay calm. He was the judge. He had to be fair, no matter what. But inside, questions began to grow. What had happened to Sammy? How did he end up here? Did he really steal from a charity, or was there something more to the story? He looked down at the papers again, but the words were blurry. He glanced back up. Sammy stood there, eyes on the floor, hands at his sides. He didn't seem to recognize Elliot yet. The court clerk called out the charges. The prosecutor stood and started talking, but Elliot wasn't really listening. He was stuck in the past, in memories of summer days, bikes, tree houses, and a promise they once made to always look out for each other. The courtroom buzzed with quiet whispers. Outside, the sun shone through the windows, but inside, something had changed. This was not just another trial. This was personal. And Judge Elliot Thorne knew, deep down, that nothing about this case would be easy. Judge Elliot Thorne tried to keep his mind clear, but it wasn't easy. As the trial continued, memories kept rising like waves in his head. Every time he looked at Sammy Harper, the man sitting in the defendant's chair, he didn't just see someone accused of a crime. He saw the boy he used to know. They had been close, so close that people in town called them the Marlowe twins, even though they weren't related. They did everything together: school, sports, weekends, even summer jobs. Sammy had always been the wild one. He took risks, spoke his mind, and had big dreams. Elliot was more quiet, always careful, always planning ahead. But their friendship had ended suddenly. One fight, one mistake. Both had said things they couldn't take back. After that, they walked different paths. Elliot left Marlow Creek and studied law. Sammy stayed and started working odd jobs. They hadn't seen or spoken to each other since that day. Now all those memories came back as clearly as if they had just happened yesterday. Outside the courtroom, the world went on as usual, but inside, the air felt heavy. The prosecutor, a sharp man named Mr. Hamilton, began showing documents to the jury. Papers with numbers, bank records, donation reports. He said that Sammy had taken money from a charity he helped run, money meant to feed families and help the poor. The jury watched quietly. They took notes and nodded. The evidence looked strong. But Elliot kept looking at Sammy. Sammy didn't speak. He sat still, his hands folded, his eyes on the table in front of him. He didn't look up, not even once. His suit was slightly too big, and his hair looked like it hadn't been cut in a while. There were lines on his face, and his shoulders looked tired. Elliot wondered, what had Sammy been through all these years? The case moved on, and witnesses were called. One of them, a man who worked at the charity, said he saw Sammy acting strange before the money went missing. Another said Sammy was always arguing with the other founder, a man named Victor Ramsey. When Victor took the stand, He spoke calmly. He said Sammy handled the money and made the reports. He said he trusted him until things went wrong. His voice didn't shake, and he looked the jury in the eye. His story sounded clear, but something about it felt too smooth. Judge Elliot couldn't explain it, but it didn't sit right. He had learned to read people in court, and something about Victor seemed off. Still, he had no proof, only a feeling, and feelings had no place in court. As the day ended and the court was dismissed, Elliot stayed behind for a moment. The room emptied. The wooden benches creaked as people left. Elliot sat still, staring at the empty chair where Sammy had been. He had a job to do. He had to be fair. But deep inside, a voice whispered, "What if your friend is innocent?" The next morning, the courtroom was full again. People whispered as they waited for the judge to arrive. Some had come just to watch. Word had spread that Judge Elliot Thorne knew the man on trial. No one said it out loud, but the air buzzed with quiet curiosity. Elliot entered the courtroom, just like he always did. His face was calm. He nodded at the bailiff and sat down, but inside, his thoughts were racing. He looked at Sammy again. Nothing had changed. Sammy sat still, looking down at the desk. He hadn't spoken much since the trial started. His lawyer had done most of the talking. Her name was Claire Nolan. She was young, but spoke with strength. Today was her turn to speak again. She stood up and walked slowly to the front. She began to tell a different story, one that didn't match the one the prosecutor told the day before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Claire said, "we agreed that money went missing, but the question is, who took it?" She explained how Sammy had tried to fix problems at the charity, how he had asked for a second audit, how he had written emails asking questions no one wanted to answer. She said Sammy had been pushed out right after raising concerns. Elliot watched her closely. She showed papers, emails, and even a message from Sammy to Victor Ramsey. In that message, Sammy asked about large payments that didn't match the charity's mission. The reply? Silence. Victor, who had looked so calm the day before, now shifted in his seat. Claire went on. "My client may not have a perfect past," she said, "but that doesn't mean he's a thief. He saw something wrong and tried to speak up. And now he's the one on trial." Some members of the jury leaned forward. Others scribbled in their notebooks. The room was quiet except for Claire's voice and the sound of pages turning. Sammy still didn't look up. Elliot felt torn. His job was to listen, to guide the trial fairly. But part of him was watching every detail like it meant more. Maybe it did. When Claire finished, the judge called for a short break. The courtroom emptied again. People stretched and talked in low voices. Elliot stayed in his chair. His eyes drifted to a small notebook he kept by his side. It was where he wrote thoughts, reminders, things to look into. He opened it and wrote one word, Victor. Then he sat back and stared at the door. He remembered how Sammy used to hate unfairness. Once as boys, they had seen someone cheat during the school game. Sammy had spoken up, even though it made him unpopular. He had always hated lies. Elliot looked out the window for a moment. If that same boy still lived inside the man sitting across the room, then maybe this wasn't the open and shut case people thought it was. After the break, the courtroom filled again. People settled in their seats, waiting for the next part of the trial. Some leaned forward, eager to hear more. Others looked around, whispering quietly. Judge Elliot Thorne returned to his bench. His face was steady, but his thoughts were not. The name he had written in his notebook, Victor, kept repeating in his mind. Something about the way Victor had spoken didn't sit right with him. It was too smooth, too prepared. The next witness was called. It was a woman named Mrs. Leona Parker. She had worked at the charity for 6 years. Her job was helping with records and reports. She was soft-spoken, but her eyes were sharp. She looked nervous as she took the stand. The prosecutor asked her simple questions first, about her job, her duties, her knowledge of Sammy. She answered carefully. She said Sammy had always been busy with paperwork and meetings. He was the one handling most of the finances. Then Claire Nolan, Sammy's lawyer, stood up. "Mrs. Parker," Claire said gently, "did you ever notice anything strange in the reports?" Leona paused. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand. "Yes," she said, A few times. Claire asked her to explain. Slowly, Leona told the court that sometimes large amounts of money move between accounts without clear notes. She said she once asked Sammy about it, and he told her he had already reported the issue to Victor. And did Victor do anything? Claire asked. Not that I saw, Leona replied. The courtroom grew quiet. Did you ever see Sammy take money for himself? No, Leona said firmly. Never. The prosecutor tried to question her again, but her answers stayed the same. She had never seen Sammy steal anything, and she didn't trust Victor Ramsey. After she left the stand, the courtroom whispered again. People were no longer sure what to believe. As the day came to an end, Judge Elliott called for the court to recess. Everyone stood as he left the room, but instead of going to his office, he took a walk down the hallway. He needed air and space to think. Halfway down the hall, he turned a corner and stopped. Sammy was standing there alone. He looked up, and their eyes met for the first time in years. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Sammy said in a quiet voice, "I didn't expect to see you here." Elliot nodded slowly. "I didn't expect to see you here either." The silence that followed wasn't angry. It was heavy with time, with years of distance. Two people once close, now standing far apart. Sammy looked down at the floor. "I messed up a lot in my life, but not this. I didn't steal that money." Elliot didn't answer right away. He just watched him. Finally, he said, "The truth will come out." Then he walked away, his heart full of questions. The next morning, the sky was gray and cloudy. A light rain tapped on the courthouse windows as people filed back into the courtroom. Umbrellas dripped near the door, and coats hung over chairs. Inside, Judge Elliot Thorne sat quietly at his bench. He had barely slept the night before. His thoughts had circled around Sammy's words in the hallway. "I didn't steal that money." Elliot wanted to believe him, but belief wasn't enough in court. The law needed proof. The trial continued. More witnesses were called. Some added small pieces to the story, but none brought anything big. The room felt tired, as if everyone was waiting for something to break the silence. Then it was time for Victor Ramsey to return to the stand. The man walked in wearing a dark suit and a polite smile. He looked confident. He greeted the court with calm words and answered the first few questions with ease. He repeated his story. Sammy handled the money, Sammy managed the reports, and Sammy was the one in charge when the funds disappeared. But Claire Nolan, Sammy's lawyer, was ready. She stepped up with a folder in her hands. Her voice was calm but steady. "Mr. Ramsey," she began, "do you remember this email?" She held up a printed message, dated 8 months before. It was from Sammy to Victor, asking about missing funds and payment records that didn't match the donation list. "I may have seen it," Victor replied, shifting slightly in his seat. "Did you respond to it?" Victor paused. "I don't remember." Claire nodded. "How about this one?" She held up a second message. Again, Sammy asked about a payment made to an unknown account. I might have missed that one," Victor said. The courtroom grew still. Claire walked slowly across the room. "Mr. Ramsey, why didn't you ever respond to these warnings? Your co-founder was trying to fix a problem." Victor's hands tightened slightly on the stand. "We were busy. There were many things going on." Too busy to answer emails about missing money. Victor didn't reply. Claire turned to the jury. "We are not just dealing with mistakes. We are dealing with a man who tried to do the right thing and was ignored." People in the courtroom shifted. Whispers rose and fell like waves. Judge Elliott watched Victor carefully. The man's smooth face now showed small cracks. His answers came slower. "Subscribe if you're following this closely, because what happens next may change everything." The judge leaned back in his chair and glanced again at the notes he had written the day before. Questions circled in his head. He could feel something was wrong with Victor's story, but he needed more than a feeling. As the day ended, Elliot made a quiet decision. After court, he would make a call, not as a judge, not as Sammy's old friend, but as someone who wanted the truth, because truth was the only thing that mattered now. Judge Elliot Thorne sat alone in his office after court had ended for the day. The room was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. The rain outside had stopped, but the air still felt heavy. He stared at a number on his notepad. It was the contact for the state's financial crimes unit, people who could dig deeper than anyone else. Elliot didn't make the call right away. He sat still for a moment, thinking through every step. Finally, he picked up the phone. "This is Judge Thorne," he said. "I have reason to believe important records in an ongoing trial may need to be reviewed by your team." Quietly, the person on the other end asked a few questions. Elliot gave only the facts. No opinions, no personal thoughts. He kept his tone even. When the call ended, he sat back and let out a breath. Now all he could do was wait. Meanwhile, across town, Claire Nolan sat at her desk in a small office. She had stacks of papers spread out in front of her, along with Sammy's old reports. She was looking for anything that didn't match: dates, numbers, names. She found something. A payment made 3 days after Sammy had left the charity. It was large, too large to be normal, and it had been approved by Victor Ramsey alone. She checked again. Sammy's name wasn't on the report. In fact, the record showed that Victor had moved money between accounts under the same project name Sammy had questioned. Claire's heart raced. She quickly made copies and wrote a note to herself: "Bring this up in court." The next morning, the courtroom was full again. Word had spread that something big might happen. People were talking in low voices, glancing at Sammy, Victor, and Judge Thorne. Elliot entered and took his seat, his face calm as always. Claire stood. She asked to show new evidence. The judge allowed it. She walked to the front and handed out copies of the report. "This payment," she said, "was made after my client no longer had access to the accounts. Yet it was signed off using a project name he had raised concerns about weeks earlier." She turned toward the jury. "This is not a mistake. This is a trail." Victor's face turned pale. He tried to speak, but Claire cut in. "You told this court Sammy handled all the money, but he was gone when this happened. How do you explain this?" The room went silent. Victor shifted in his seat. His voice was low. It was part of a planned expense. Nothing more." "Then why did you hide it?" Claire asked. He didn't answer. Judge Elliot watched every move. Deep inside, he knew the truth was starting to rise to the surface, and once it did, there would be no stopping it. What began as a simple trial was turning into something much bigger. The courtroom buzzed with tension. The silence after Claire's last question felt louder than any shout. Everyone could see it. Victor Ramsey was starting to fall apart. His hands trembled slightly, and his voice no longer held its calm tone. Judge Elliot Thorne sat still, watching every detail. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed Victor closely. The prosecutor stood up, trying to bring the focus back to their case. He asked Victor a few quick questions, hoping to rebuild trust. But Victor's answers were short and shaky. The jury noticed. Then, just before the session ended, Claire stood once more. "Your Honor," she said, "I have one final request before we close for the day." Elliot nodded. "Go ahead." Claire turned to the screen at the side of the courtroom. "I'd like to show a recorded interview taken by an investigator just last night." A video began to play. It showed a woman sitting in a small room. She introduced herself as Marcia Lewis. She used to work at the charity 2 years ago. In the video, Marcia explained how she was asked by Victor to sign off on reports she hadn't written. She said she felt pressured and left the job soon after. Then she said something that made the entire courtroom go still. "Sammy warned me not to get involved with anything shady," Marcia said in the video. "He said if anything went wrong, Victor would blame it on him." The video ended. A few people in the audience gasped. Sammy still sat quietly, but his eyes were wide with surprise. Claire looked at the jury. "This is not just about missing money. It's about a man who tried to speak the truth and was pushed aside for it." Judge Elliot gavelled the court to close for the day. The people rose from their seats, talking in hushed voices as they left. Sammy stayed behind for a moment, looking around the room. The same room that had once felt like a trap now felt different. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt the weight start to lift. In his office, Elliot sat down with a fresh report sent from the Financial Crimes Unit. It was a short summary, but it confirmed everything Claire had found. Accounts had been moved, payments were made without Sammy's name, and all signs pointed to Victor. Elliot leaned back and closed his eyes for a second. The case was changing, and soon the jury would see it too. Outside the courthouse, the clouds had cleared. The sun was finally breaking through, casting soft light over the old brick building. Sammy walked out slowly, breathing in the cool air. People still watched him, but this time, not with doubt, with questions, with interest, and maybe even with hope. The courtroom was quiet as the final day of the trial began. The jury sat with focused eyes. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens and cameras ready. Everyone knew this day would decide everything. Judge Elliot Thorne walked in and took his place. His face was calm, but his heart carried the weight of the truth that had come to light. Over the last few days, the story had changed. People had started to see the full picture. Claire Nolan stood up one last time. She walked slowly to the jury. "You've heard the facts," she said. "You've seen the records, and you've seen how my client was blamed for something he didn't do." She paused and held up a folder. "This file contains proof. Emails, payment trails, and witness statements that all point to the same truth. Sammy Cooper tried to stop the wrongdoing, and for that, he was pushed out." The jury watched her closely. "It's easy to blame the quiet man," she continued, "the man who doesn't fight back. But justice is not about what's easy. It's about what's right." She stepped back, and the room was still. The prosecutor gave a short reply. He looked tired, his confidence gone. He no longer pushed hard. He simply said the jury should decide based on what they believed. After closing statements, the judge gave his final instructions to the jury. Then they left the room to decide. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some were there out of curiosity. Others had followed every day of the trial. They waited in the cold morning air, hoping for an answer. Inside, Sammy sat alone at the defense table. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, nodding once. She didn't say anything, but her eyes showed calm. She had done all she could. Hours passed. The jury stayed behind closed doors. Everyone waited. Then the bailiff entered the courtroom. "The jury has reached a verdict." People rushed back to their seats. Judge Elliot returned and nodded for the jury to speak. The foreperson stood. "We find the defendant, Sammy Cooper, not guilty." Gasps filled the room. Some people clapped. Others just sat in silence, taking in the words. Sammy closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. He had waited for this moment for so long. Outside the courthouse, cameras clicked. Someone shouted questions. Sammy stepped out into the light, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man carrying a heavy name. Judge Elliot watched from a window above. He didn't smile, but his eyes were steady. Deep inside, he felt he had done what was right. The truth had taken time to come out, but it had come. And as the courthouse slowly emptied and people went their separate ways, the story of the judge and the man he once called friend would be remembered. Not for the trial itself, but for the lesson it gave. Sometimes the past returns to test us, and sometimes the truth wins.